Hey everybody, welcome to the China Threat and the Future of Our Nation. This is Benji Gershon with Dallas Jewish Conservatives. Hope everyone is doing well. Happy Passover to all my Dallas Jewish Conservative members and other Jews across Dallas and across the country that are watching, and to all my Christian friends, a very happy Easter to everyone as well. Hope everyone is staying safe and healthy in their quarantines at home. With their families, and just want to wish everyone the best before we start off. So without further ado, this is our second event, our second online virtual event, and we have many more in the pipeline, and we are pleased to have the great Frank Gaffney with us. Frank, a little bit about Frank. He acted as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the International Security Policy under President Reagan. He also served as Mr. Reagan's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy, a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee under its chairman, the late Senator John Tower, and a legislative assistant to the late Senator Henry M. Scoop Jackson. He subsequently founded and is now the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. In addition, Mr. Gaffney is the vice chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. And a couple of house rules before we get started. Please make sure you keep yourself on mute. And if you have a question, please type those questions into the chat box, and Frank will be more than happy to answer those as soon as possible. And feel free to ask as many as you want. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Frank Gaffney.
Benji, thank you very much. And let me add my welcome to all of you as well. I hope indeed you are having good Passovers, as I am having a very happy Easter. I'm going to move through a lot of material here very quickly in the hope that I'll be able to have a good amount of time left for Q&A. I'm going to tell you a story at the outset in which, as it happens, Jews in the United States and elsewhere played a very important role in dealing with what President Reagan used to call the existential threat to freedom of his time, which of course was a nation that has largely been lost to memory. I'm going to try to make sure that I can move the screen, and I don't seem to be able to do it, even though, Benji, we just worked this out. Maybe you can send me that connection again. Did you just move it, or did I?
You did. I'm sending it to you right now.
Good. All right. So again, this is a statement that he used often, and I think is unfortunately as true today as it was back in his era. Indeed, I call these the war for the free world, the various phases of which I've been in several of them, and it's as important today as ever to have that in mind. It's not cooperating with me again, Benji. There we go. Let me see if that'll do it. Yeah. So again, this is going back. This is the existential threat to freedom of the Reagan era. I had a small hand in helping him contend with it. The presidents before him had adopted a policy towards the Soviet Union called détente. And détente was essentially a fancy French term for engagement with the Soviets, trying to basically enrich them in the hopes that they would be better behaved. It wasn't working out. And in the late 1960s, some of you may be old enough to remember this, but perhaps your parents or grandparents do. This movement began to try to do something about what was being done to Soviet Jews by the regime in the Kremlin, which was horrific, very, very significant repression, many of them in mental institutions and gulags and the like. And these banners started appearing outside of synagogues and some churches across the country. I remember vividly growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, riding my bike to school outside of and past the Tree of Life synagogue. This banner was very familiar to me from that time. The, sort of wellspring of those banners turned into, as I say, a movement. You have a parade going down Fifth Avenue, something you don't see these days, of course, but back then this was a pretty big deal, and it was evidence of the political clout that had begun to build behind saving Soviet Jews. As it happens, as Benji mentioned, I worked for a guy who was able to take that political clout and translate it into a veto-proof majority in the House and Senate for legislation called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. That amendment essentially precluded the Soviet Union from getting what they not only wanted, but turns out desperately needed, namely most favored nation status, favorable trade arrangements that would, again, enable them to be even more massively enriched than détente had provided to that point. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment said, in order to get that status, you need to let the Soviet Jews, and anybody else for that matter, out of the Soviet Union who wanted to go. The Soviets wanted no part of it. They refused to do it. They didn't get most favored nation status. And that began to be a sea change in the way we were dealing with the Soviets. It turns out that shortly thereafter, a group called the Committee on the Present Danger began to form up. It was an informal pickup team of people who were, you know, national security professionals. They were subject matter experts. They were business leaders. They were human rights activists. They were religious freedom champions. And they had as one of their members Ronald Reagan. And in the run-up to the 1980 election, the Committee on the Present Danger became a very important vehicle for him to articulate a different strategy towards the USSR. Among the people that were helping him, as it came to pass, challenge this guy, Jimmy Carter, a proponent of and practitioner of détente, were some of these folks. You may remember them or know of them at least. There were some 38 of these people who, after having crafted this alternative that came to be known as peace through strength, the platform on which Ronald Reagan won election in 1980, he pulled them in to actually help him execute the strategy. This has been called by some the divine plan. It was implemented with help not only from, of course, Ronald Reagan, but Margaret Thatcher and not least Pope John Paul II. And ultimately, it brought down the Soviet Union, freeing not only several million Jews, but hundreds of millions of others who had been enslaved by the evil empire. So, informed by this experience, we have come to believe that it's time for a new Committee on the Present Danger for China. And this group has got many of the same kinds of individuals involved, national security practitioners and so on. And we're working now to see what we can do to help challenge this regime in Beijing. Its purposes are captured brilliantly in a book that was written in 1999 by two senior colonels in the People's Liberation Army entitled Unrestricted Warfare. I'm going to talk you through what that means for both the United States, most especially, but also for the rest of us. Interestingly enough, some years before that, in 1991, this fellow, Deng Xiaoping, enunciated to some of his senior leaders that the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was over. The Soviets had lost. A new Cold War was then beginning between the United States and China. And China, he said, would win. The way it would win would be to hide its true intent and bide its time as it built up its capabilities. And it was very much the idea that in the interval, until it was strong enough to really challenge the United States, it would rely on those sorts of techniques that the two colonels had identified to wage a kind of war against us, particularly economic warfare. But we'll talk about some of the other ways in which this war is being waged. Interestingly enough, of late, the engagement policy, it's no longer called détente, but the idea of engaging with China has begun to be seriously challenged. The hiding and biding, of course, was a critical element in enabling these successive leaders of both parties in the United States to continue to try to empower, to enrich, and otherwise to legitimize the regime in Beijing. And it simply has become more and more obvious, I think, to many of us that it's not really worked out. And we'll talk more about that in the present moment in a second. Just very quickly, the fellow who is now in the job Deng Xiaoping held, Xi Jinping, has been rather more direct about the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. No more hide and bide. What they're doing at this point basically is trying to ensure that they are the dominant power. They've built up enough strength economically, politically, strategically, militarily now to challenge us, they believe. And yet, interestingly, in the context of the pandemic that the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, has unleashed on the world, I personally find it most accurate to describe it as the CCP virus. There's a lot more of that deceiving going on again, a lot of propaganda. We'll talk about it more in a minute. Specifically about the nature of the disease, the provenance of the disease, and how it's going in terms of China's efforts to contain it. These deceptions, very much consistent with Deng Xiaoping's practices of hide and bide and so on, have, as I think you probably are all aware, materially harmed both the United States and the world. I mean, Benji mentioned we're all in lockdown. That's just one example, of course, of what the consequences of this practice of concealing from us the true threat that this disease represented for weeks, and in the process allowed it to proliferate widely and take down now tens of thousands of people around the world and cause incalculable damage in economic and other terms. Let me just sort of point out that I think the perhaps only upside to all of that hardship is it has really impressed upon most Americans, I think, the fact that the way China conducts itself, its deceptions, its manipulation of the facts and markets and so on, is a serious problem for the United States. And it's creating an opportunity for now, I think, even more than before. Donald Trump certainly began practicing this idea from the inception of his presidency, but he's now got a level of popular support, I think, for a different approach to China that we really haven't seen since Reagan was able to get a mandate to take a very different approach to the communist threat of that day, namely the Soviet Union and its evil empire. Just a quick point, though, I believe, based on a very important poll that John McLaughlin, I personally believe he's the best pollster in the country. He's the president's pollster, among others. John did a poll before really the pandemic began to shape public consciousness as it has today. Back at the end of January, he went into the field and he canvassed 1,000 likely voters. And what he found was really stunning. This is just one of the top lines. The question was, are you worried if China were to become the world's dominant power? And you see there, a very substantial majority felt worried about it even then, let alone now. And interestingly enough, I sense that probably most of you, like Benji, are political mavens. I found as interesting as that and other top lines, which fairly consistently showed overwhelming majorities, very robust about China. And especially the more they learned in the course of the poll about some of the things that the CCP was up to. We actually saw in the so-called crosstabs, the subgroups, the demographics, if you will, of the poll, those majorities were virtually unanimous, irrespective of whether they were old or rich or white or poor or Christians or something else, or educated or not. In each and every instance, with I think maybe only one slight exception in one demographic, it was a slam dunk. So there's a lot to work with here, folks, is the point. As Donald Trump looks at the post-pandemic strategy for proceeding, I think he's going to benefit from strong support from the American people, further intensified, of course, by their experiences with this pandemic at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. So let me just walk you through quickly some of the elements of the kind of warfare that the Chinese Communist Party has been and is waging against us, to our great detriment, and I believe that of freedom-loving people around the world. I'm going to go through these, as I said, rather quickly, so hang on, and if you have questions, please push them into the system here, and we'll try to address them. But I'll try to get through this in good order. First, there's this question of the trade practices, and of course, President Trump has done heroic work on that in the 3 years of his presidency. He has fought back for the first time, really, since the advent of this policy of engaging the Chinese under Richard Nixon. He has pointed out that in these various areas, the currency manipulation, the denial of access to their markets, the practice of, if they can't buy it, stealing wholesale intellectual property. I don't know if you're aware of the scale on which this is being done, but by some estimates, official estimates at that, it's between $500 and $600 billion per year worth of intellectual property. Think of it. You're familiar, I know, with things like the cartels that the Chinese Communist Party has created. A particularly prominent one is involving rare earth minerals, resources that we have to have for much of our electronics and advanced business systems and not least our weapons. And that's not a good thing if they have the corner on that market. We'll talk more about this, I think, in a moment, but the Chinese have also been using their wealth to try to acquire vast tracts of American high-tech companies and otherwise, gain an edge over us with the various, .com and other sorts of technologies. And much of this is, again, sort of bottom line, aimed at dominating supply chains for the future with both strategic and economic and political consequences, as well as military. One example that is now common knowledge as a result of this pandemic, but wasn't really until it burst forth, despite the efforts of the co-author of this book, who is a member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, wonderful author and analyst by the name of Rosemary Gibson, is our medicines and other medical gear. It is, again, now not such news, but it is still horrifying that the Chinese supply us with the vast majority of either the finished drugs that we rely upon or the active pharmaceutical ingredients, as they're called, the APIs that go into drugs that are finished here or in India or elsewhere. This has become obviously a huge problem. And what's of such concern is it's true of much of the world's, at least until recently, sterile masks and gloves and gowns that are critical pieces of what's called personal protective equipment. You can't rely on a foreign nation for virtually all of that, let alone one that is hostile to us. And that's for two reasons, basically. One, you can find that the source decides to adulterate the product. And there is example after example, as Rosemary's book documents, of Chinese communist companies selling drugs that actually are toxic. It's actually killed some Americans in some cases. But even if they don't adulterate the drugs in ways that make them harmful to us, not helpful, there's always the problem that they can cut us off, as they have to some extent in the course of this crisis, from, if not medicines, certainly some of the PPEs. So that's a problem with supply chains. Another problem is what I think of as the Chinese Communist Party's colonial empire building gambit that is called by by Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative. This map just gives you an example of really a snapshot. I think it's out of date. In fact, I was just reading this morning about progress that they've been making in Latin America, putting in place these Belt and Road Initiative arrangements, which for a variety of reasons are quite problematic. Typically, for example, it involves getting countries to agree to have the Chinese build them all kinds of infrastructure, ports and highways and road networks and rail networks and seaports, and also, as we'll talk about more in a minute, the sort of digital infrastructure that is also part and parcel of what the Chinese are trying to do to dominate these countries and indeed the world. They're doing it on credit, so these countries are often seduced into agreeing to participate in the process. They're getting all this free stuff. Does that sound familiar? And yet, when it turns out they can't make the credit payments, it's a debt trap, or if you will, payday loan kind of scheme. What China is rather systematically doing is simply expropriating those assets and making use of them not only for commercial purposes, they're typically in strategically interesting places or in places with access to important natural resources the Chinese aspire to control. Boom. When the debt trap closes, they're able to take them over more or less, as well as use them as places from which to project power, the old-fashioned kind of power. I'm not talking about soft power here. I'm talking about military power as well. When you talk about the military, I think it's important to appreciate, as this parade through Tiananmen Square on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the enslavement of the people of China by the Chinese Communist Party back in October, you saw on display a superpower's weaponry. Now, again, some of that is stuff they've gotten from us. I mean, literally have stolen from us the designs for their 5th generation fighter aircraft, as just one example. And this has enabled them to essentially leapfrog with all of that, stolen intellectual property or in some cases purchased, to be now a peer competitor, at the very least, if not in some areas actually surpassing our own military. This is a busy slide, but it just gives you some examples of the ways in which this is now beginning to become a problem for us, not just in the Western Pacific, but elsewhere. They've built a chain of islands that they've fortified despite promises not to do that, but in other ways as well, elsewhere, in Africa, as I mentioned, in Latin America, including now in some allied countries in Europe. They are beginning to assert both their presence and their ambitions in ways that are very ominous indeed. Very quickly, let me just touch on this problem that I mentioned in connection specifically with that book, Unrestricted Warfare. How has this asymmetric threat business manifested itself in our own times? And here are several examples. I'll touch on each of them pretty quickly. Electromagnetic pulse is perhaps the most important piece of the electromagnetic spectrum. If such a pulse is used against our electric grid, it will take it down, at least in large parts of the United States, if not nationwide. The Chinese understand that. They've built it into their doctrine. They are capable of taking out the United States without firing a shot, in the sense that an EMP detonated overhead wouldn't kill anybody, at least not initially. We've jumped ahead magically to a second spectrum in this warfare domain, space. Most of us, I think, don't think of space as a battlefield, but it is. You dominate the high frontier, as it's been called. You dominate what goes on the Earth. The Chinese understand that. They've been taking the sorts of steps that are identified on this slide to give them a dominant position in space and take advantage of the fact that the United States has not been competing very much in that regard. Certainly hasn't until the president, I think, helpfully decided he wanted to have a space force for that purpose. But we are playing catch up at a time when the Chinese are in a position, I believe, to deny us access to and the use of space if they choose to do so. Let's see. There we go. A third area of asymmetric warfare involves something called 5G. I suspect you all are all familiar with what that means. It's the 5th generation wireless technology. It really represents such a quantum change from the 4th generation as to be almost a totally different beast. The idea is to power, among other things, the Internet of Things, enabling access to data and the control of things that can be very, well, militarily useful, strategically valuable. It also can permit you to have access to intelligence secrets. It is working at the moment to fracture our alliance, as some nations have bought into a company called Huawei's approach to 5G. And I think the speaker, Gingrich, is absolutely right. He has characterized this as a test of surpassing importance between two civilizations. And as of right now, we are not competing very effectively with the Chinese and are at real risk of losing on the 5G domain. As things stand now, I think that's all's not lost, but it's late again in the day. Finally, I just wanted to mention this, and again, this is a point that is perhaps more obvious today than it was a month ago. We've been subjected to the Chinese Communist Party's information operations and propaganda incessantly since this pandemic began in Wuhan. But I just wanted to share with you some of the infrastructure that the Chinese have built and are using in our colleges, in our media, in our culture, in our laboratories, in our government even, to try to influence and, well, subvert us. And I think this is an immense problem again, an area in which we are not competing very effectively. We used to do it rather well. It was a big part of Ronald Reagan's strategy for fighting the, fortunately, non-kinetic Cold War to a satisfactory conclusion with the Soviet Union. You remember, he famously described it as the evil empire. That was a very calculated effort to delegitimize and ultimately to undermine, decisively the communist regime in Moscow and across that empire. I just wanted to close by saying, I think when you put all of these together, you have a sense of a very determined adversary willing to use all of the instruments of power to try to accomplish their ultimate objective, which, as Xi Jinping has made clear, is world domination. The question is, how have they been able to afford to do all this stuff? And I want to close with what I think is, in some ways, the most important element of this entire briefing. Sorry, back again. We are underwriting virtually all of the things that I've just shared with you. How have we been doing that? We've been doing it as one of the most important manifestations of this whole policy of engaging with the Chinese. Remember, I said détente was about the proposition that if we just made the Soviets rich, they'd behave better. Well, it didn't work out with them, and it certainly hasn't worked out with the Chinese. In fact, to a degree that makes what we did with the Soviet Union and what they did with our help pale into insignificance. The Chinese have taken, by some estimates, $3 trillion from American capital markets and invested them in companies that are engaged in the sorts of things that are in those bullets. This may seem incredible, and it is incredible. It actually is outrageous. In fact, it's obscene. Because one of the things that is now afoot, as we speak, is an effort by people on Wall Street, specifically a very prominent figure by the name of Larry Fink, who runs what I think of as the 800-ton gorilla on Wall Street, BlackRock, to begin migrating the retirement investments of U.S. government employees, federal government employees, both civilian and military, into companies like the ones that are alluded to in those bullets. So think about it. We're at the cusp, all of things being equal, of having our men and women in uniform compelled, if they want to have an international portfolio in their retirement funds, compelled to invest money in companies that, among other things, are building the weapon systems with which to kill them. And us, by the way. As I say, I consider that to be obscene and something that needs to be stopped. So the thrift savings plan is a sort of microcosm of a larger problem. That is, the idea is that we've spent $3 or so trillion to the Chinese Communist Party to date, is the prospect that they are poised to try to get out of us another $3 to $5 trillion. And this fellow Larry Fink is one of those who is determined to help them do it. And again, I believe that must not be allowed to happen. So that brings me to my conclusion. Very quickly, to recap what we've shared. We are facing, I believe, a vastly more dangerous adversary in the Chinese Communist Party than anything the Soviet Communist Party ever manifested, including all of those nuclear weapons that it built during the Cold War. We are dealing with an adversary that is now increasingly a peer competitor, if not in some cases, as I said, even more powerful than we are, who seeks to dominate the world. To get there, it has engaged in unrestricted warfare, and it still is. But increasingly, it is now capable of other kinds of warfare, the kinetic kind, the old-fashioned kind, if you will, that could be disastrous for our country, not just for its folks in uniform, but for all of us, as well as, I believe, for the world. Finally, we have had an opportunity with this pandemic to think, I think, as a nation, afresh about what we're doing. And if the sorts of sentiments that the American people seem to be signaling in that poll that we did back in January are any guide, we're actually going to see, I think, more of a demand in this election season, if we ever get back to it, for a course correction with respect to China. Enough of this engagement business. It's time for a different strategy. Which brings me back to the Committee on the Present Danger, China. We are working hard to help make sure that people like yourselves have an authoritative appreciation of the threat we're facing from the Chinese. We're trying, as the Committee on the Present Danger did in the 1970s, to make that kind of information available as widely as we can, and to shape, in particular, as that previous group did, the electoral battle space, not in a partisan way, but in a policy sense, to make sure that there is coming out of this election, we hope, a mandate for an important course correction from the kinds of engagement practices that we've undertaken to date. And with that mandate, we hope we will be able to play a role in the next presidency in implementing that course correction, much as our predecessors did under President Reagan. So with that, I will wrap by saying there are some obvious things that need to be done. Your help in doing them is simply incalculably important and urgently needed. We need to understand the trade. As horrible as our past conduct of trade and the degree to which it has enabled the Chinese to eat our lunch is just one part of a strategy, a comprehensive strategy with respect to the Chinese that needs to be very much redirected, involving, among other things, disengaging from China. Not to have nothing to do with them, obviously, but to stop propping up the Chinese Communist Party, to stop enabling the sorts of threats that it is now increasingly and brazenly mounting against us. Most especially to stop paying for it, for heaven's sakes. You know, Lenin is alleged to have said that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we'll hang them. What we've been doing, folks, is we've been financing the sale of the rope with which the Chinese Communist Party is now very seriously trying to hang us. We have, I believe, the opportunity and the necessity for actually identifying and pursuing a very different policy, one that has at its core the determination to compete effectively and decisively with China across the broad front. Among other things, this will require that we start investing in our own country, patriotic investing, if you will, to build up these capabilities, whether they're technologies or whether they're restoring our domestic supply chains or whether they're investing in our infrastructure or our research and development for our military or in any other way. We need to make sure that we are no longer compounding the problem that we face from China. We are investing in ways to beat it. And finally, and this is hardly the last in importance, but it is one that I will conclude with. We need to make sure that we are challenging the Chinese Communist Party in the information battle space, as they have been us. We need to project the values and the traditions and the opportunities that our kind of system provides, because it is going to be vastly more attractive than what the Chinese communists have on offer. Again, not just what they've imposed upon their own people, including through Orwellian super repressive techniques like what's known as the social credit score. I sort of had it on a slide, but I didn't get into it. This is a means by which they are now able to essentially monitor the comings and goings, the sayings, the behavior of everybody in China 24/7, which is an incredible instrument for totalitarian control. And they are now exporting it around the world. That has to be contested. I think part of doing that contesting is making sure everybody understands what this evil Empire 2.0 is really all about, and how much more attractive freedom is, and why they want to be on our team, not on the Chi-Coms. With that, I will conclude by simply saying thank you for your attention today. If you're interested in learning more about all of this, there's a wealth of material, a lot of it in video form, at the Committee on the Present Danger China's website. That is presentdangerchina.org. It's a project of the Center for Security Policy. We appreciate support for the work that we are doing in this regard and otherwise, and you can find out more about that at securefreedom.org. Benji, thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Frank. That was really insightful and an eye-opening, quite frankly. So really appreciate that. We got a bunch of questions, so we'll get right into it. First question from Fernando is, what options do nations have available to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for the loss of lives and economic losses caused by COVID-19?
It's a good question. A lot of thought is being given to it, I think, at least in certain circles. I think hurt them economically. Disengaging is going to make a big difference in what the Chinese are able to do. Bring back those supply chains from China. That would make a material difference, I believe. Stop underwriting them. That would make a profound impact on what the Chinese are able to do. It would cost them dearly. And finally, an idea that's been brooded for some time, back before there was a Chinese communist dominated People's Republic of China, there was a Republic of China. It issued sovereign bonds backed by gold. Thousands of American citizens bought them and held them to varying degrees ever since. The Chinese government has said, wait a minute, that was the previous government. We don't have any obligation to honor those bonds. By some estimates, they're worth $1 trillion now. I personally believe that if the United States government were to buy those bonds and go to the Chinese and say, look, we're simply going to write down what we owe you, which is, by some estimates, $1.3 trillion, I believe now, in part in retaliation for what you've done to the world and to our people. And the full faith and credit of the United States government is not at issue here. We're simply going to exchange debt you owe. And by the way, when they say, well, wait a minute, that's not us, they actually, when they secured Hong Kong from the British government, part of the surrender terms for the Brits was the Chinese had to honor those bonds that were held by British citizens. So the principle's been established. I think that's another way in which we could effectively extract, whether they want us to or not, reparations from the Chinese for what they've done to the world.
Great. Thank you for that, Frank. And next question from Adriana is, what is your opinion in regard to Venezuela and the China relationship in general?
This is a great question. I mentioned that one of the things that was a little off in that map about the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is the degree to which the Chinese have managed to insinuate themselves into most of the countries in Latin America. Venezuela is perhaps, next to arguably Cuba, the worst. Venezuela has a large Chinese presence. It is indebted immensely to the Chinese because they bought up future oil production from Venezuela as a means of justifying the financial propping up they were doing of Venezuela. The Venezuelans have been getting from both the Russians and the Chinese arms. They've given them, essentially bases from which to operate. In short, and I might add, in addition, the Cubans and the Iranians are in Venezuela as well. There would be no Maduro regime, let me be clear about this, in Venezuela today, to the horrific detriment of the people of Venezuela, if it were not being propped up by the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and the Cubans. Even the North Koreans are in there, I think. And that is a blight, not only for the people of Venezuela, but for others in the region. I mean, there are millions of Venezuelans who've been forced to flee their country, who have now taken up residence in neighboring states. And not least, just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, the United States government indicted Nicolas Maduro and 14 of his cronies for engaging, among other things, in what the government of the United States has called narco-terrorism against the American people in the manifestation, the form of drugs that they've brought into this country, which contribute to the loss of, by some estimates, 70,000 American lives per year. So for all these reasons, this is a horrible regime, a threat to us as well as to our interests in the region, and it's being enabled in a small measure by the Chinese Communist Party.
Great, thank you. Next question from Gidon. It's regarding Israel. Israel is strongly invested in China, and especially vice versa as well. Do you have the ear of anyone currently in the Israeli government?
Well, as with the US government, I have their ear in the sense that I talk at them a lot. I'm not sure that they always are listening. We do have friends in the Israeli government. We have lots of friends in Israel who I think are as concerned about what Israel has done, among other things, in sharing technology with the Chinese. I think they've gotten through the Israelis technology that they will almost certainly wind up using against us, and in their sales of that technology to some of Israel's foes, like Iran, they might wind up coming back and harming Israelis as well. I'm particularly concerned. They're not alone. We have our own problems in this regard, frankly, but I think the fact that the Israeli government let the Chinese into, and I think has a sizable role in, the port of Haifa is a very serious problem. It is, I think, impacted the willingness of the United States Navy to send its warships for important port visits there, lest they simply wind up being preyed upon by the Chinese espionage services and the like. So as my old boss, Scoop Jackson, was a very, very committed Zionist and supporter of the US-Israeli relationship. This is painful, though, I have to say, and I think that the Israelis will hopefully come out of this pandemic and, please God, with a new government, inclined to make more sensible decisions about both their trade with the Chinese and their allowing the Chinese to have a presence in Israel.
I couldn't agree more with that. Great point. Another question from Mike. What are we doing, or what could we be doing about this today that will turn the tide back in our favor? Example, CFIUS reforms, dual-use technology protections, university reforms, etc.
Well, I've mentioned a few. Those are additional ones that I think certainly make sense. I guess basically what I'm arguing for, and our Committee on the Present Danger of China has been espousing, is a comprehensive, all of country response. We're told that's what is needed, and it is, vis-a-vis this Chinese Communist Party pandemic. But it's also true of the Chinese Communist Party's other pandemics, the other threats that it's posing to our country. And so, yes, I mean, everything from trying to counter their information warfare, their espionage, their intellectual property theft, their influence on our campuses, their influence in our newspapers and other media. I don't know if you know this, but the Chinese now have, in some cases, I believe, twice weekly supplements, which they simply insert as paid advertisements into papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times. Now, given the nature of the reporting that's done in those papers' other pages, you may not be able to detect that there's an appreciable difference between the Chinese propaganda and the propaganda on their behalf. But the point is, we're giving them vehicles to, disinform the American people. There's no such counterpart capabilities for us in China. And we need to try to work around the great Chinese firewall and the other techniques that the Chinese try to use to ensure that we can't inform their people about the truth. Not least, folks, we need to, I think, be really on a war footing at this moment. I personally believe it is entirely possible that the Chinese Communist Party will do what totalitarians have frequently done in the past when they get themselves into trouble. And I think this party is in trouble. The economy is in trouble. The results of the pandemic have been a terrible, black mark, I guess you might say, on the Chinese Communist Party and its handling of this thing. What totalitarians often do in such circumstances is engage in what the political scientists call social engineering, by which I mean, look over there, folks. There's a foreign enemy that is threatening us. We must address that enemy. We must fight them. We must rally around the flag in order to rise to the challenge it poses to us. In short, I would not be surprised, frankly, if sometime, maybe even in the next month, the Chinese launch an invasion of Taiwan. I pray to God I'm wrong about that, but it would be something that I think is not only something they've aspired to do for a long time, they've been putting into place. I've talked about the military capabilities they've been building. A lot of them are suited to and located in proximity to where they'd want them for the liberation of Taiwan. They'd like to take it over without having to fight. Obviously, that's Sun Tzu's tradition, but they could well go for it. And the fact that 3 of our nuclear-powered aircraft carriers are currently tied up because their crews have been afflicted with the Chinese Communist Party virus, I'm afraid is only further emboldening them to think this may be the time to do it.
We have several more questions. By the way, Frank, if you don't mind just holding your mic a little closer for a little bit of feedback there.
Sorry.
The next question is from Asher. Why do you think President Trump has backed down from his strong rhetoric blaming China for this pandemic and referring to the virus as the Wuhan virus? I'm also interested in that one.
Well, I think he started calling it the China virus or Chinese virus or Wuhan virus when the Chinese propagandists started saying, actually, the US Army brought it to Wuhan in military games that took place in October. And the president rightly found that to be not only untrue, of course, but so offensive that he decided he was just going to tell the truth from the platform of the White House press conferences. And he did it repeatedly, as you know, and they finally got the message. I don't know if this was directly communicated between Xi Jinping and President Trump in one of their phone calls, or whether the Chinese just decided this isn't working for us, let's just stop brandishing this propaganda narrative of the US being really responsible for this disease. But whatever it was, I think that's why President Trump stopped saying it, because they stopped making that propaganda against us. I think if you go over the record, I think he actually still sticks it in every once in a while, but it's obviously much less of a leitmotif of his press conferences than it was for a time there. Gotcha.
Next question is from Juan, and he asks, do you think the benefits of utilizing 5G in our country outweigh the possible dangers spoken about by the experts, including yourself?
Look, I'm very concerned, I must tell you, about dangers of two kinds. One is that the Chinese Communist Party, through Huawei, could continue to try, or ZTE, another of their, sort of corporate entities that they use to promote telecom penetration and domination. I'm very concerned about the possibility that we'll continue to allow, for example, in rural communities, Huawei technology to be utilized. We've stopped allowing it into our military systems, or at least so we're told, and to other networks in this country. But we're still, I think, allowing some of it here, and at the very least, we're still allowing some American technology to be sold to Huawei, which they in turn use to try to maintain their dominant position. That's a mistake, it seems to me. I have to say I'm also concerned, and I don't know enough about it to speak authoritatively, but I've been exposed to some impressive data and analysis that suggests that there are real health risks associated with the kind of microwave energy that is being used to power these 5G communications. As you may have seen, these transformers, transistors, transmitters is the word I'm looking for, transmitters for 5G signals, because they're relatively short range, have to be widely spread. There are some who say that part of the reason that the virus was so lethal in Wuhan is it was the first city in China that was massively populated by these transmitters, literally in some cases outside of every house or apartment building. If you think about this as essentially, being microwaved, as in your microwave oven, it shouldn't be surprising that there will be adverse health consequences for human beings. Again, whether this is entirely true or not, I don't know, but it is interesting that we've had in Britain people taking to the streets and destroying some of these transmitters that have been located to this point in the British telecommunication system. Some of them, by the way, built by Huawei.
Interesting. Another question we have is regarding freedom of speech, and it asks, from the NBA to Hollywood, for example, Top Gun, which removed the Japanese and a Taiwanese flag from Tom Cruise's jacket in the movie, and even now in the World Health Organization, what should the U.S. do domestically and globally to combat communist China's abilities to strangle our freedom of expression and anything perceived as anti-People's Republic of China, aka the Communist Party of China?
Yeah, well, this is such an important question, and I'm really glad that it's been asked. As I indicated, the Chinese have made a point of penetrating not just our newspapers and other media outlets, but the culture itself. They've figured out that if they buy movie theaters, or they buy studios, or they simply say, you're not going to be able to sell your movie in our theaters in China, you will not be able to have access to our vast market. The consequences of which can be the difference between success and failure of a motion picture these days. They have demonstrated that they are able to persuade people to toe what effectively is the Chinese Communist Party line. As to what needs to be done about it, look, I think it starts with having a much more comprehensive effort to understand the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party and what it's doing. Again, this is one of the upsides of this pandemic. Perhaps the only upside is that a lot of us are now thinking very differently about that. but we need to act on it. It's not enough just to recognize that there's a problem. And I think, you know, personally, my view of this is we need a rebirth of patriotism. And that means that we need to have the American people both taking pride in their own country again, something which an awful lot of us don't do very much of. And we need to stop, you know, believing that we are really worse than everybody else. And if only we accommodate them and their agendas, even if it's at our obvious expense, that we will be somehow proper citizens of the world, as it's been called. And you hear this coming not just from the Chinese, of course, themselves, but you also hear it from their allies in what's been described as the globalist community. And it's insidious because you've got sort of the hard left and globalists joining forces for this purpose, often running down our own country and certainly creating this sense that we need to accommodate and engage on whatever terms we're given by the Chinese. I think, again, this is a moment when we have an opportunity to revisit all of that, and hopefully with, you know, the help and leadership of people like yourselves, we'll get this right going forward. Great.
Couple more questions, if so many that hopefully you don't mind, Frank, we go a little bit over time here.
That's okay.
So next question we had was, would you recommend that the U.S. government issues a stimulus bill like the one Japan just announced for companies to bring back manufacturing plants to the U.S. from China?
Well, I have to tell you, I'm heartsick at what has been seen as necessary to try to contend with this pandemic. I think the extent to which we have now been just not even opening the treasury, it's the cupboards is bare. We're just printing money. And the idea that we need to generate much, much more public spending in order to do something that every business in this country ought to have the wit to understand it needs to do, namely to come back where the rule of law is practiced and to stop chasing the elusive goal of a vast Chinese market that is not going to be open to them at the end of the day. It's just not going to be open to them. But I would add this, I think we have, as I've mentioned, an immense amount of money, even yet, having suffered on Wall Street what we have at the hands of the Chinese pandemic. There is an immense amount of money that people like Larry Fink are intent on sending to China. Well, how about we send it to American factories that can be built in this country? How about we spend it on, you know, retooling factories that are currently operating to make them more efficient, able to be much more competitive against the Chinese slave labor even? How about we really work on investing in what we do best, arguably, in the whole world, which is R&D and innovation, high technology. Those are the sorts of things that I think will make us much more competitive into the future. And honestly, I don't believe we have any choice but to do that kind of investing patriotically and here at home. But it has to be part of a sort of a reboot of America loving as well as America first policy.
Hear you on that. And then also, what would you say currently is the greatest threat to the U.S. and the Western world today between, I mean, if you had to say between Iran, China, you know, Russia, what in your opinion is the biggest threat currently?
Well, I don't know if this questioner was not present for my presentation, but I hope that it wasn't lost on the rest of you. I think China is the great existential threat to freedom of our time. Does that mean that Iran is not a problem? Of course not. Most especially to Israel and our other friends, such as they are in the Middle East, our friends in Europe, but also us. Does it mean that Russia is not under Vladimir Putin? Far from it. Russia is a very serious problem. Russia has engaged, just as a data point, Russia has engaged in the wholesale modernization of its strategic and tactical nuclear forces. at a level and in a scale and on a magnitude that I believe would dwarf what they did at the height of the Cold War. At least when you factor in the relative capabilities of our own deterrent forces, which basically haven't been modernized since I was in the Pentagon over 35 years ago. That's a very, very troubling situation because you have a guy in Vladimir Putin, and this is a digression, but quickly, you have a guy in Vladimir Putin who actually routinely presides over war games in which he's playing the role of the president of Russia, of course, who exercises strategic nuclear attacks against the United States. So I'm in no way, shape, or form deprecating Putin as a problem either, or even North Korea for that matter. But China is in a class by itself because of all the things we've been talking about, because of the degree to which it has penetrated our economy and dominates supply chains and steals intellectual property and is dominating space and is building out a colonial empire worldwide and is, now competing with us and in some cases, as I say, surpassing us militarily. These are a whole different class of problems, and I think we have to regard them and behave towards them as such.
Got it. A question from Fernando is, do you believe if there's a solution to stop universities from working with foreign governments like China and Saudi Arabia?
Important question. I think some of them have decided to stop doing it voluntarily. I think some, specifically, they've shut down the Confucius Institutes that I had on one of the slides. Again, I'm not sure that that name means anything to most of you, but this is a totally unreciprocated opportunity that the Chinese Communist Party has had to establish on, I think it's something like 170 campuses across the United States, virtually all of the leading institutions of higher learning in our country, a facility staffed by Chinese Communist personnel, people that they select to come to this country to teach, to propagandize, otherwise to influence impressionable students, nominally teaching Mandarin, but in practice, really trying to teach about everything having to do with China and Asia and so on. And more to the point, controlling whatever else is being taught on campus. If it doesn't happen to conform to their requirements, they will object. And because these institutes provide money to the college administration or university, they have considerable influence. They also can actually dictate who can come to the campus and speak from the outside. So this is a degree of influence operation that is truly extraordinary. And fortunately, I believe there was language introduced into the Defense Authorization Bill several years ago, maybe now, that said, if you're getting money from the federal government, specifically, I think from the Defense Department, but I think other agencies as well, to support your academic research or other work on campus, you can't have Confucius Institutes on the campuses. So I think that's helped catalyze some of this, but we ought to be doing this much more rigorously. And it really speaks to the larger point, Fernando. Reciprocity ought to be the bare minimum that we insist upon vis-a-vis the Chinese. And by and large, we haven't. Engagement has been more or less on its terms to this point. And this is one of the other things that I think Donald Trump deserves great credit for trying to challenge and change. And hopefully he's now really got the wind at his back for doing that as a result of the pandemic.
Interesting. Wow. I'll take two more questions here. First one is there any possibility the U.S. would do a reboot of our monetary system or implement a digital currency in the near future, in your opinion?
I don't know. This is not something I'm terribly knowledgeable about. I'll tell you what I've been hearing, and that is that the effect of that lack of discipline, to put it charitably, that I spoke of a moment ago with respect to what we're doing with essentially printing money. And by the way, I mentioned this fellow Larry Fink. Not only does Larry Fink have unbelievable power in the private sector, because his company BlackRock controls, by some estimates, $7 trillion in its own right, and then maybe as much as 17 trillion through the stakes it has in other companies. And Larry Fink is a globalist and has been making a big push to have every one of the companies that he has that kind of swat with conform to his program known as Environment, Social Justice, and Governance, which is probably familiar to you all as one of the means that the left is now trying to use to essentially get capitalism to serve it. Just again, as an aside, by the way, Larry Fink is also pushing China as a place to invest money, even though it's the worst in the world, arguably, on environment, social justice, and governance. But anyway, the point is that Larry Fink has been given enormous responsibilities under the $2 trillion so-called stimulus package, and a big chunk of the $4 trillion that the Federal Reserve has been given to try to help the economy as well. So there's a concentration of power here, folks, that I find absolutely chilling. I think unprecedented in the history of this country. And it is very worrying that it is in the hands of a guy who on the one hand is a globalist who plays with the hard left and is willing to use his power to advance their agenda, and secondly, who plays with the Chinese Communist Party and is definitely advancing their agenda. So back to the question. One of my concerns about not just Larry Fink's role, but about the lack of discipline in how we've tried to respond to this crisis is that I've had people tell me that this is going to greatly enable and enhance the Chinese and others, the Russians, the Brazilians, the Saudis have played in this as well, South Africans, effort to essentially remove the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, which would have incredibly negative effects on our economy, our debt, and so on. And one of the ways in which they're talking about this is, since none of them has a currency that is a viable alternative, is to come up with some kind of, cryptocurrency that would draw on something, maybe gold, maybe something else, special drawing rights of the IMF or something to back it. I don't know enough about it other than to relay that to you. It sounds right to me that enemies of this country want to take the dollar down as the reserve currency. Whether they can do it with a cryptocurrency or some other, I don't know. But I think we have to be alive to that danger. And it's an argument for not, going back to what I said earlier, for not compounding this problem by printing still more money. Or as some have said, borrowing more money from China in order to pay for this sort of crazy stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then finally, hopefully we'll end up with a little good news, some levity maybe. Are you in contact with President Trump and his administration? If so, is there any advice that you would give him personally if you had 5 minutes with him on the phone? And then also to end here, is there any good news or best case scenarios that you could outline, relative to the scenarios that you've outlined in this presentation today?
Oh, as you may have figured out by now, I'm not long on good news or levity, but I'll try my best. I've met personally only once with the president since he came to office. I wouldn't consider myself an intimate of his by any means, but I do have a lot of friends in the administration and have been in touch with them a lot, particularly of late in connection with this pandemic and what we might do about it. if I had 5 minutes with the president, I think I would spend every moment of it trying to counteract the clear influence that Wall Street enjoys with him. Larry Fink personally, he's called him one of the smartest people in the world in one of his recent press conferences. Steve Schwartzman, another one, runs Blackstone, another big company. The guys at Vanguard and Fidelity and so on. I mean, these are people who I think consider themselves globalists first. They're not America first folks. I think he's in part under their considerable influence because obviously back when we had a stock market that was booming, that was very much a prime justification for the reelection of this president. At the moment, not so much. And I think, as with so much, as I've said again and again, with this pandemic, it's an opportunity to rethink some of the things we've long been thinking. And I personally believe that if Donald Trump understands, and I hope it will happen most immediately in connection with this thrift savings plan decision that is, as I said, in the immediate offing, to move $50 or $60 billion minimum, maybe even more, of a $600 billion portfolio of retirement funds for American men and women in uniform and civilian employees, past and present, into China. That must not be allowed to happen. And I would argue that vehemently with the president, and more generally say, you need to impress upon your pals in Wall Street that they have to invest patriotically in our country. There has to be an America first approach to investment, as in all other cases. And finally, I guess in the good news department, I personally think, as I've said, that we have a chance with this pandemic to do much better with respect to the Chinese Communist Party. And I will just leave you with a titillating news item. It's not released publicly and I won't get into the details, but I will tell you that I have become aware of a natural supplement that has been shown to be effective in countering COVID-19, and that it has no adverse side effects in the 1,000 instances in which it's been given to patients having various ailments. This is, I think, going to become public knowledge here very shortly. I'm very excited, if it's so, that we may have at hand the means by which we can actually get people back to work. We can rebuild our country, making more sensible decisions in some of these areas. And we can, I'm confident, beat the Chinese at their game of trying to become the world's dominant party, which I think is vital to not only our freedom, but that of those who love it around the world as well.
Wow, you dropped quite a teaser there, Frank. I might have a lot of messages after this wondering what that supplement is.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Frank Gaffney, everybody. Thank you so much for your time, Frank, and for everyone tuning in. You can find out more information, www.presentdangerchina.org. Definitely check that out after this presentation. And stay tuned for our next event. As you see on the screen, the systems of socialism and nationalism and you. It's our next virtual event on Sunday, April 26th at 1 p.m. The great Evan Syed, he's an author, columnist, political humorist, and speechwriter for President Trump. Just a great guy and very knowledgeable on the subject. Has several books out that are worth checking out, and you don't want to miss that again. Sunday,
and he's an actual levity guy.
He's an actual levity guy.
Professional comedian of great renown. So you'll have a great time. He's a good friend of mine, and I'm so glad you got him on. Benji, again, thank you for letting me address your group, and my best for Passover and Easter to all of you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Frank. And everyone, please, if you want to register for that, check out DallasJewishConservatives.com, or you can subscribe to the event on Facebook. And make sure that if you haven't subscribed, put your email in and we will get you all the latest. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day. We'll see you all soon. Take care.